Okay.
So I think I have to find a good balance on that.
Um, yeah, I mean, it's the thing that stands out quite a bit to the viewer, and it's something that I think that if you're going to take these same skills forwards for future pieces from the studies, that like the studies are an opportunity for us to practice our skills for when we're doing imaginative work, and trying out a technique that you haven't done before is an excellent idea to do during the studies. But I would try to use this as a platform for finding the best approach to if you're going to be doing figurative pieces to like figuring out how the figure fits with the background. And like we have this weird balance where it's like the deep background is very like loose and gestural, which is good. But then we have the same kind of looseness in the figure in the foreground, and then this middle ground area, we're getting a lot of crispness and a lot of clarity and a lot of detail. And it's a little weird to have that sort of middle space be the part where everything ends up getting all the attention. So that's my big feedback for this week.
All right, thank you.
All right, thanks for sharing your work. And for the VOD at home, I'm streaming on Twitch today. I hit the stream to Twitch, but I forgot to hit the record button until just a moment ago. So sorry, this was the first crit. You missed the beginning of the first crit. So CDB, I don't know if we've had you around here before. Really, really great looking study. They're coming up on stage.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hey, welcome.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Oh yeah, great seeing your work. This came out really, really well.
Thank you.
It seems like you've got more experience doing these kind of pieces than I do.
Well, that's a big thing to say. Thank you.
The likeness is unbelievable. I mean, it seems like you have a lot of experience doing figure drawing. Am I correct?
I wouldn't say a lot.
Okay, I guess
I've
it's
been,
relative.
I've been, yeah. I mean, I've been drawing for a little over 5 years.
Oh,
A little
okay.
bit of a
Wow.
late bloomer.
Oh, incredible results for just 5 years.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, this came out fantastically. I was really struck by how well it came out. In your comment, you said that you had used the Chris Young color method. I looked it up. I had never seen his stuff before. I looked it up in the minute before I went live today, and I was disappointed to discover that he's using my least favorite coloring method, which is the color blending mode.
Hey, I heard you say that a long time ago. I can't recall where, but I thought that was ironic. Yeah, I noted that.
Yes. And so I wanted to take a moment to explain what I think is wrong with this method. And is not, it's, I'm going to demonstrate because now that I've seen, he seems very accomplished as an artist. So I don't want to like, it's like not universally a bad idea, but I want to like explain what I think is, using his method, what's harder about it and like what's not good about it. So he's got like this sphere, right? And he's using this to express like, oh, we've got some unrendered surface here. He's giving a figure drawing example, which I think figure drawing is where you might actually be able to get away with this. And then he's got, he's like filling a layer with gray and then taking it to color and then color balancing it to be like a cool base color, right? And using the color blending mode to be able to get this base color seems like it would work on the surface of it, because what he explains is that all the other blending modes are going to screw with your values, but the color blending mode can be relied on because it will not screw with your values. And my perspective is that this is exactly the reason you should never use the color mode for stuff like this, because he's showing, you can see this in his example, in this sphere, no matter how saturated you end up going with this color, you almost never get any saturation in the highlight. And that's true for lighter colored skin, is you tend to get a fairly pale highlight. So it'll work in that circumstance, but you can see as we start to turn up the saturation, and he was commenting how you really don't want to turn up the saturation too bright because you end up with this really crazy looking artificial shadow color that's way oversaturated and looks really unnatural. And you can see how the saturation between the darker parts of the sphere and the lighter parts differ pretty substantially based on this method. And in reality, this actually isn't a problem. Like if you have an actual sphere that's a color and you had the ability to move its color around, you would actually see that the color of the highlight would change depending on the local color of the object. And so the color, while this seems like a pretty effective way of getting certain kinds of objects colored, the problem with the color blending mode is that it will allow you to have this like, it'll preserve these highlights in this way that is always going to look like desaturated and washed out. And you end up having, I haven't watched the whole demo. He explains that you have to go and blend a bunch of stuff on top of it in order to get better colors in a kind of oil painting like way, which I agree with. But I think like part of the reason you need to do all that, and every time I see someone use the color blending mode, they always have to do like a second and third step afterwards, is because it does an absolutely shit job at highlights. When you use something that like a hard light, you can see how we start getting, now the highlight colors actually start to look fairly natural. It ends up compressing our value range pretty significantly by doing it this way. But that's actually what does happen when stuff gets to be a bright color. Bright colors have a more compressed value range. That's realistic. And so I'm always pushing people to try to use blending modes which better reflect the natural behavior of color. And the color blending mode, I'm discovering, I thought it was this weird thing. It was like something I did back in college and then I learned better. And I'm discovering there's all these really great expert artists that have it like buried in their process and are advocating it to a whole generation of people. And I'm like freaking out. I'm like, please, let's not do this. So I have strong feelings about it, but I'm really interested in checking out Chris Young's work more because his stuff seems really good and his tutorials seem excellent. So I'm going to check out more of it. That rant aside, what was your experience like with the assignment this week?
Well, it was a difficult method to use. I think I have gained one insight as to why it works for him. And if you noticed, he uses primarily a soft brush with texture.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of this method, what makes it work is you have to match your color changes to your value underpainting.
Yes.
And it's kind of labor intensive. So one thing that makes this work well for him is that he uses a soft brush and he uses more or less the same one across both steps.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, what I did was I used a harder edged brush like I normally do to do the values. And then I mimicked his coloring process with a soft brush. So there was this soft brush dictating the color changes with harder edges for the values. So there was a discordance between the value change and the hue shifting.
You know what? I don't actually think that's a problem personally in the way I work, but you've worked out the values very far along before you moved into color. And this is actually one of the reasons why I usually do my color step earlier in the process. If you're doing a very classical method of having a really strong set of like values and then glazing color over the top of it in like a classical oil painting method, you need to be really careful about the way that you do those glazes. And you're right, having a soft brush to glaze in color when you have a lot of hard edges already established is going to result in a lot of weird little, I could see a little bit of like warmth sort of leaking out over the top of the hairline here. And personally, I like to get messy with this stage, specifically because a lot of the accidental colors that arise from blending modes like hard light will end up creating useful colors that are useful when I go and start rendering over the top of it on a normal layer. So I see this as like a place where all of the colors are kind of getting brewed up so that I can like then draw from them later. And so a lot of the like little accidental colors that arise in the process come from a lot of this messiness. But if you don't want the messiness, if you have a really refined value study early on, the messiness is just going to get in the way and force you to make more corrections later. So you would need to use something that has a little bit of a harder edge and be a little bit more controlled about it when you're laying it down. And I am noticing in some cases here you have like the highlights are a little bit washed out, and like the colors. I think your values came together really incredibly here, and I thought the color choice that you made to have like a really saturated background but a more desaturated and kind of realistic foreground was a really striking one. But like the skin tone that you're getting here does, if you were going for a realistic one, does actually feel a little bit washed out for the exact same reason I was talking about, where it's even if it doesn't matter how saturated you get, the color layer does not allow you to saturate highlights very well. And so if you want to start showing a little bit of that warmth of the blood in under the skin, and you like on a specular highlight, yes, it's going to be desaturated, but if it's not a specular highlight and you want to start showing some subsurface scattering, it's going to you're going to want to start using a blending mode that's going to allow you to bring some of that warmth in. One of the very first techniques that I saw being used was multiply, because even though it's darkening everything, multiply will allow you to bring in a little bit of natural saturation. So like, I'm not saying that you need to use this one, but like there's a lot of different like personalities in each of these different blending modes, and you can see that when we're getting away from these, we're getting away from like the specular highlights, that you can start to bring some of that warmth back into the skin tone through other blending modes. Like in this case, multiply is doing a decent job of it. I'd say overlay ends up, you have to end up picking some very specific colors. You have to kind of like find your way into a color range that's going to glaze well in order to start to bring in some colors like that. And then it's also useful for bringing in like colors into your fill lights and like reflected areas. Because you're always going to end up seeing a certain amount of, it depends on the color approach you're going for. Because if you're trying to make a big statement by separating out the color in the background from the foreground, you're not going to want to do it. But if you're looking to have colors that are blending sort of across the whole scene, you're really going to want to start to use these blending modes to start to carry these colors between these elements. And like, even if you have really separate values, like if you have a really, really dark background and you've got nice highlights on your character, using some of the same colors across the foreground and background with the right blending modes are going to give you very, very different colors, but they're going to be complementary to each other because they're sort of coming from the same root. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, there's many thoughts. I think one of which the first thing you started with was I was noticing that the face and the lights look pretty washed out.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that was deliberate. And I think the reason why is because originally I crept too far into the oranges.
Mm-hmm.
And when you have that next to the blue, it just looks so yellow that when I backed it off, I just decided to go desaturated. But I maybe should have just done a hue shift because I saw your multiply was just red and it worked. And I was like, okay, so keeping the hue shifting, like, or maybe I'll just keep the bright light portion in the reds instead of the oranges. And that would have solved that problem.
The way I typically do it is like the colors that you're picking are dependent on the blending mode. Like the colors that I pick for hard light are going to be different than the colors that I'm going to pick for multiply or overlay or soft light or any of them. And so you're not going to be able to have like a sort of unified theory on it. You need to sort of just develop a feel for whatever color is going to work well for whatever blending mode that you're using. And then once you start getting the results of this math problem that you're carrying out, you're going to end up with these, you can take those blending modes and start to like this is wrong, right? But like we can go and start to hue shift through all this and try to find the colors that are not going to end up looking too yellow in contrast with the blue background. And then once you have the colors all in the scene, just normal painting over the top of it and start to sample back and forth in order to be able to like tie it together. But yeah, the do you have any questions?
Is there anything else like moving forward? Is there anything that I could focus on in my other practices that you see going wrong in here?
No, I mean you seem like you're doing you seem like you're very very comfortable with this kind of piece, like studying from a photo and like doing figurative work. It's done at a very high level. I don't have anything specific to call out about it. It's you know you're at the point where I might have more feedback if I was looking at like a complete portfolio and knew more about your creative intent. But as far as fundamentals go, I mean you're bang on. So if you have any questions for me about my approach to stuff, or second guessing anything about the way you've done this, like happy to answer them. But I don't have anything off the top of my head that's like popping out. I do want to call out for everybody who's watching that like the approach that you've taken to this, it's a very, very careful one. Working out the drawing very precisely, sticking very closely to that drawing, having worked out all of the structural issues, and establishing your values very confidently and very completely before moving on to color. This is an approach that I tend to be like looser at every one of these stages and then tighten everything down at the very end. But this level of tightness at each step is a way that a lot of people do it. And, it's a very good example of that. So it's great to be able to show an example of a different approach to this problem than what I would normally do. So great job.
Thank you. And thank you for your time.
Yeah. All right. Next one, we got another first timer, Remy. Is Remy with us today? I'm looking through the audience. Remy, if you are with us and you want to be on stage, feel free to raise your hand. Oh, you're there. I see you typing. If you don't have a mic, it's fine. Having a mic, that's fine. Remy wrote, hello, it's my first homework here. I had a lot of trouble with the colors, which are too dull, but I'm quite satisfied with the clothes, the face of the lady. I learned a lot of things. I wouldn't have time to push the rendering further, and I tried a night version 2 with gradient maps later. It's very cool seeing two different approaches to this. And this is what I was saying at the top of this episode about how because we're looking at a potentially low light image, the amount of color that we're going to see in the scene is kind of dependent on whether or not like we see this as a really low light, dark nighttime image or something that is more during the day. That our perception of color and light change quite a bit depending on the exposure level, because naturally in our own eyesight, in low light, we tend to be more sensitive to more blue hues, that the cones in our eyes that sense blue are slightly more sensitive than the ones that sense warmer colors. And so we get this like natural hue shift for low light images. I had this period of time where I was working on a vampire game and everything was at night. And so I would just do black and white concept art, and then I'd throw a gradient map over the top of it, and I'd be like, it's in color now. And I went through huge stretches where I didn't color anything. I just procedurally colored it by just color grading a black and white image and calling it done. And I got away with it for a while. In really low light circumstances, you don't actually need to define the color of anything. And we have this interesting contrast between, in daylit scenes, there is a lot less of a we see a lot more of local color and a lot less of the colors of the lights. And then in darker scenes, we see very little local color and almost entirely colors of the lights. And in my work over the years, I have done it both ways, where in some cases a painting will be entirely color graded or, just colored lights. And other times it will be very brightly lit and I will show almost entirely local colors with only with a lot less deference being paid to the color of the lighting. And both of them are essentially right. It's a stylistic choice. The philosophy behind how you put the colors together tends to be different depending on how you're going to approach this. Gradient map is one of those things where it's very good at establishing a way of sort of procedurally establishing the color of lighting. I found that a balance between the two tends to be a good fit for me, and I do that in a lot of my studies where I will do something that grades the overall image using something like gradient map or selective color or color balance, while also manually painting in a certain amount of local colors using a blending mode to create glazes or just painting over the top of the image with normal colors. And yeah, so it's very cool to see the balance of both of them here. I this is today. It seems like we're going to talk a lot about color because this is sort of the nature of it. What I found interesting also is that a lot of the submissions were done in black and white first and then colorized, which is the way I typically do it, but it wasn't actually an essential part of the lesson. Theoretically, you could have painted the whole thing in color from the beginning because you're going to end up in color, and a lot of people start in color, right? But I don't know. I think that once we kind of back away and get back to this black and white first, it is easier to think through it from the stages of doing a black and white image and throwing in some color grading and then building up local colors on top of it. I think it's a pretty natural way to think through things, but everybody's way of thinking is different, obviously. I think that for this specific piece, I think that there's a couple of things that I think you could do a little bit better with. Number one is I would like to see you work through the drawing a little bit more early on to make sure that you have the proportions and pose and likeness a little bit more clearly established before you move on to the rendering and colors. I also think that when you get into the rendering, I'm seeing a lot of these very scrubby brush marks. And to me, that's an indication that you are not changing your brush dynamics very much throughout the piece. You've got one brush and you are not touching the settings and you're not switching your brushes a lot and you're scrubbing through it and it's got this kind of aggressive, scrubby look. I think that the dynamics that you have going on this brush are fighting you a little bit. And I think there's a point where I think early on when you're trying to establish blocks of value, it can be nice to lay things in really thickly like this. But once you want to start going into blending, there's two things that you really need to keep in mind. Number one is you're probably going to want to turn the opacity down. So if you're having a hard time getting to those opacity sliders on Procreate or whatever, maybe look into seeing if there's a way you can get some Bluetooth hotkeys or something. I typically turn my opacity down to about 40% when I'm doing blending. The other thing is make sure you're using a brush where there's some sort of fall off to it. I like to keep the flow low. My flow's down at around 10%. That gives this little bit of fall off to the edges of the strokes. This makes it so that rather than scrubbing up and down to get these marks, if you go and you work laterally against them, everything softens up in a nice natural way. So if you keep if you wanted to smooth things out and create a softer look, even with a hard edge brush, it's totally possible. You just got to make sure that you're running counter to the direction of your strokes and you keep your flow low. The flow is a consistent property across different pieces of software. So whether you're using Photoshop or CSP or Procreate, you'll get the same effect. Because what it is it's the flow determines how many little brush stamps get added in before it builds up to a full stroke. So that's a consistent property across a lot of different painting programs. Do you have any questions for me while I've got you here? I know I wasn't able to look at the chat. Paint directly in color. Okay, cool. Yeah, painting directly in color is totally a viable way of doing this. I saw somebody else commenting saying they tried to paint directly in color in this and it was way harder. And yeah, it's like trying to paint directly in color when you're looking at a black and white image is super hard. I think that the challenge of taking a black and white image and reproducing it in color is one of those things that like leads to wanting to try this method of like starting black and white and then going to color. You point out my problem now. Thanks for your advice. Hey, happy to help. Thanks for sharing your work. All right. We've got Wiber. You're there in the audience. If you have a mic, feel free to raise your hand. Come on stage and chit chat. Painting black and white and turning colors is not natural. Some people, starting in color is the most natural thing to them. And for some people, starting in black and white, adding color is most natural to them. I used to go straight into color. I now do black and white into color. It's a matter of preference. I cannot imagine starting in color anymore. It sounds crazy to me. No mic. Sorry. Okay. No problem. So this piece was really striking me for a couple of reasons. There is a so that obviously I think one of the first things to notice is that you've got this the head of the character is very large. You've got this head that is very exaggerated and large, and there is like also a little bit of feeling like everything's on the hand and arm is kind of like stretched and pulled sideways. I I wondered if perhaps like there's something about the way that you're working, like on an iPad, being held in a weird way, or something that's causing your perspective to shift. But honestly, I think it also stylistically is kind of cool. Like I think that the way in which it differs from reality is kind of cool. Um, the other thing is like there is this like sense of the blurriness of the background gives this sort of sense of motion. It's got this kind of David Lynch uncanny vibe. And I don't know if that's entirely intentional or not, but the really extremeness of the yellow and the really extreme green and the extreme red and like the skewing of the proportions and the kind of energetic, weird, blurry background that's kind of shiny looking all together has this like striking mood to it that I thought was pretty cool. But I was really crossing my fingers hoping that you would be on mic so I could ask you a little bit more about your feelings about it and like where you're coming from, because I don't know how much of it's accidental, how much of it's like your natural style, or like what's unintentional and maybe I'm just liking something that you think of as a mistake. It's always hard to tell like how far something is a mistake versus how much it's a style, because style is just an accumulation of mistakes that we decide to keep. And I don't know. I think that there are some things that are depart quite a bit from reality in this piece that I crossed my arms when I saw it and I thought, I kind of want to do that. That's kind of cool, actually, to go that extreme with the color of the background. It's not realistic, not even a little, but I also kind of don't care. And really, like doing the proportions quite a bit different with like the very big head. Also, to me, feels like a kind of a stylistic swing. I don't. I mean, feel free to tell me in the text chat, like if I'm where this commentary hits with you. But both, yeah, it's yeah, okay. It's if it's stylistic, like great. Like I'm not gonna be like, oh, your style's wrong. Like your style's up to you. Um, the super, I really like the using like breaking down different colors into different segments and having them be like so there's a thing that people do that is pretty universally wrong, which is that when they go to make an object, they make it so that it is just like I'm going to borrow your colors here for a second. Just lighter and darker variations of the same hue. So you just got like the same hue of green, and then you make lighter and darker versions of it over the whole thing. That's not how this works. Um, but when you do that on purpose and you do it in a way where, like, typically there is going to be some variation between the saturation or the hue between the highlights and the shadows, especially in a dark environment like this. Having the green leaves be like plasticky green, and to have the shadows be the same plasticky green but really dark and saturated is very unrealistic. But it creates a haze of unrealism in this case that to me, yeah, reminds me of like David Lynch's work, where there's a sense of artifice that you're never entirely sure what is there because he's like cutting corners or like what is like intended as an artistic statement. Oh, first time trying realistic thing. So yeah, okay. If you wanted to make this more realistic, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to introduce some of these colors to each other and let them kind of mix and linger. You're doing that a bit on the bench here, where you're bringing in some of the greens into the shadows, and also on the floor, where you're bringing in some of the greens into the shadows here. Finding a balance between finding like places where these colors kind of bounce off of each other and mix together and linger is the way that we end up with more realistic color palettes. So bringing in some of this green into the shadows on the yellow, having some of it, like the reason why we don't have pure black shadows is because there's a certain amount of reflected light that comes inside of them, and it tends to be a slightly different color. So if we are in a green environment, or she's got a bright sleeve, we might be seeing the yellow of the sleeve reflected inside the shadow here. If you are if you've done a lot of like more stylized or cartoony stuff before, and you want to play around with realistic stuff, I think you're going to find that there's going to be an interplay between more stylized work and more realistic stuff, that the two are going to rub off on each other a little bit, and that there is a harmony there that can really be struck. So if this is your first experiment into it, I recommend that you keep going. I think you're already getting some kind of interesting, unique results that are coming from your lack of experience in this space. And I think that you should continue to try to like have fun with this and make more stuff like it, because it's giving you experiences you wouldn't be getting otherwise. And you can mix that back into your other work, which is, not so focused on realism. It will give you more options. It will give you more toys to play with. So keep going. Great job, and thanks for participating. Jim, struggling with colors. This is the color talk today. Speaking of, okay, so I love I've never been able to get this effect with custom brushes. People sometimes have these very textural brushes, these digital like repetitions and fake canvas textures, and they overlay and they create this really expressive, impressionistic look, and it's super good for these kind of like suggestive plant shapes. It's something I've always failed to wrap my head around, and so here in Jim's work, it's really working out pretty well. Is Jim with us today? Jim, if you're here, feel free to raise your hand. So for the looser, more expressive bits, those crunchy brush strokes are looking pretty fun. It's a cool look. It always has been. I've always felt a little jealous of when people are able to like get that to work, because that was like the in style for years during the middle of my professional career, and yet I've never been able to do it. I've always gone a little bit more towards the traditional looking side. Jim was saying he's struggling with the colors, and so this is the color talk we've been having. It's all about blending modes at the end of the day, I think. You can try to blend in colors by taking really super saturated tones and laying them in at really low opacities. Because, when you talk about color glazing in traditional media, this is effectively what you're doing, is you're taking really thinned out pigments and you're slowly like layering them on top of each other over the values to create something that feels like it's slightly more in color. And you can get that to a degree as long as you are going way, way over the top on your saturation and you're coming in really thin and you're slowly building it up. It's doable. But you have to go way over the top on the saturation of everything because the way that digital painting programs mix color is not natural, super not natural. And so what we end up having to do instead is pick from whatever your favorite blending mode is other than color, because I have a mission against it right now. It's the enemy. And I would like some professional to pick a fight with me and explain to me why I'm wrong about that at some point. But in the meantime, you can see how we don't actually need to go so insane on colors when we're using something like hard light, and you can start to glaze stuff in. And you can start to get some really interesting secondary colors as the result of just picking something that is a little bit more desaturated, a little bit more in the middle of the color picker square here. This stuff, hard light tends to behave really well in this middle zone. And you start to get a really nice variety of tones by mixing those down. The other tools, obviously, this is a situation with it being a low light image where we're ending up having a harder time doing colors, where something like a gradient map or color balance or selective color is going to give us a little bit of a grade going. And if we want, this is a nice warm one, but if we want to do something that's a little bit more cool, it gives us an opportunity to decide, like, are we making a green painting today? Or are we making an orange painting? Are we making it weird? What are we making today? And this is the question that, like, you have to get to when you're picking out a color palette. What are we making? There's every option on here is correct, presuming we have a plan for it. And I saw a tremendous amount of really interesting color palettes in this assignment this week. So I just want to say you guys all picked out really different stuff from each other, and I thought they all looked really good. I thought it was a lot of really interesting color palettes this week. So pick whatever feels right to you, what direction feels correct for you, and just go nuts with it. The other thing I would recommend is if you're going to do something like this to add a color grade to it, don't forget that you have the option of this mask behind it. I love using the mask to help add variation. Like if we wanted to spotlight this character, you can see how we can take this yellow and we can just decide, we're going to do it everywhere but in the spotlight. And you can see how different of an effect we get by putting in a little bit of a gradient into that mask. You can manually paint this in, but I think the gradient is nice for, rather than having a big plan, it's really quick to go and experiment. So I've got the gradient tool here, and it's just black to white, top to bottom to top, side to side. And you can see how we end up with, even with the same gradient map, we can end up with really, really different kinds of feelings for the image overall by just doing this and sort of playing around with it and getting really playful with how we apply the color. And then when you start then making more mindful choices on top of that, you end up in this like infinite play space where everything is like the world's your oyster. Yeah, Bart is saying it. Said F it with fruit juice color. Totally correct. All of the possibilities are correct. So thanks, Jim, for submitting your work. Hope this was helpful. We've got Verna again. Verna, if you're here, feel free to raise your hand. I don't remember if you've got a mic or not. Verna. Went with grayscale to color approach. Haven't really used blending layers before. Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Nice.
You said you feel like you destroyed your values in the process of adding color. I've already done the rant of like, yes, you have to destroy your values in the process of adding color. It's essential in my mind.
Oh, well, maybe, but I'm just not. It feels wrong to me when I do that. I'm just
Yeah.
not used to doing it, and I'm not really used to doing to using um, like the blending modes.
Mm-hmm.
So, like painting with those, it was a lot of stacking stuff on top of each other
Yep.
without flattening down the image at some point.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at my Photoshop file now, it's like 18 different layers that they can't really merge because if I merge them together, it just destroys everything.
Right. So this is the reason that I don't do the one layer approach to things. That like all of my layers are preserved, is because when you shift blending modes a lot, the blending modes don't merge into each other. They
Yeah.
when you merge layers, they have to be of the same type. Otherwise, they change their behavior. So if you start playing around with blending modes, you end up having to either flatten it down into a single layer, or you have to keep all of them, and you don't get an in
Yeah,
between.
basically.
Yeah,
I thought I was going about it wrong because I was like, surely there must be a way, not to stack hard light on top of soft light on top of overlay or something like that. But that's probably comes
it,
from experience if you know exactly what you want and
I
how to
thought
get it.
that for a while, and I've backed away from that thought. I've thought like the reason why I have all like 4 or 5 different layers all stacked together is because I am not smart enough and I don't have enough practice, and I will someday be able to accomplish what I set out to do with a single perfect layer of like the right blending mode. And the more I tried to progress in that direction, the stiffer and like worse my work got. And once I accepted the chaos as being the actual thing that I wanted, once I accepted the fact that like the lack of control was an asset, and that the feeling of being lost and screwing around with stuff and like just feeling like a dope half the time was actually resulting in the best work that I'd created, I was like, actually, this is good. Like the discomfort and like the negative feelings, like the feelings of not knowing, were ultimately productive feelings.
I mean, I can feel that for sure, but it's probably from inexperience. It just you feel so lost that you're like, am I even doing anything good here? Like, what's happening?
Well, that's why I wanted to
But
pull out what you, based on your comments, why I pulled your thing today, is that you said it quickly devolved into organizational chaos, a lot of trial and error, and
yep.
and you said destroyed my values in the process, and I'm like, good, good, and good. Those are all green flags as far as I can tell. Like it feels weird and bad, but I wanted to encourage you and say that there are many points where your brain is telling you don't, you're doing it wrong, and you're like, no, 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 brain, I'm in charge here. And then there's this sort of situation where I'm like, no, your brain's going to tell you you're screwing it up. It's going to feel like failure, but you actually need to make sure that you always end up in that spot in order to create the most creative work. And so I wanted to say, like, you are on the right track if at halfway through the painting you feel like that. Like, you should get back to feeling like you're in control again at some point. But I think that, like, somewhere in the middle, while things are messy, you have too many layers, you're indecisive, you're feeling lost, I say good. I want to, if you stop getting that sensation, I think you probably fucked up.
I mean, I get that, but I guess because I can't do the final step, like the tightening up everything.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably why I feel like not as good about it.
Right.
But that's just
If
experience.
you can't take the result from it and then feel like you're confident in rendering it, you haven't, found what you needed yet. So yeah, that to me, that is the sign of like you still need more experience with it, because it should eventually result in, I see where I'm going to go with this. I have an idea. I'm going to push it forwards. And sometimes it takes a couple of like passes with that where you go, oh, there's actually something really cool here. I'm going to try to take it forwards. And you get a little bit further in and then you go, actually, I think I'm kind of kidding myself. I don't think this quite
Oh,
works.
I had a few of those,
Yeah.
definitely.
And then it's like back to the blending modes, back to the adjustment layers, and then you go, oh, wait, I got it. I know where I'm going now. And sometimes I will have a big stack of that, and I will wipe it all out. I will delete it all and go back to an earlier stage of the painting because I actually was kidding myself. And I think that is all. I think it's all part of the process. But there should be a point at some point down the line where you go, I see where this is headed. I have a plan. I like the results I'm getting. I want to get more into it. And you can clearly see how you're going to like add detail beyond that point. And if you don't see it yet, then you're not ready to move on. You know, you either screwed up with the colors or you screwed up with the values, or you screwed up with the drawing. You know, it's further back in time. That is the part where you screwed up. The place where people get really stuck is where they feel lost still. They don't know how they're going to finish it, and they're like, it'll be all right once I add the details. It's never all right when you add the details. If you're feeling lost, you're really lost. I just think there's value in spending some amount of time lost in the middle of a painting.
No, I can agree with that. Like artistic like pursuit always like with some like chaos in there always kind of turns up good things. But
I think like in this case, your values are not sticking particularly close to the original reference material. So if you feel like, if you feel like you are, your values are getting screwed up by your colors, like I say, fine. But if you aren't doing something really distinct with your values, then maybe you should be. Like it's like if the colors are coming into your values and you're like, oh, you're not like excited about it and it doesn't seem like it's that accurate, then like maybe back it up a step. Maybe see if you can find some additional subtlety or figure out some interesting way of stylizing the values in a way that makes you more interested to push forwards with the next step.
okay.
So
And that's kind of hard for me because I usually try to stick like as close as I can, basically,
yeah.
to the reference.
But my point is like, in general, if you feel like you are stuck, it's usually not the step you're on. There's a difference between stuck and lost. If you're being lost is good. If you're feeling stuck, it's probably not because you screwed up the step you're on. It's because you screwed up something in the step just beforehand. So it's usually backing up that is the backing up that's the correct choice.
Okay.
You know, like we have in the black and white version, like this is easy to compare the values here because we already have the image in black and white. And there are some subtleties to like the values here that aren't present in the value version. It's like
Absolutely true.
it's much more high contrast in this than in your version. And so when we add the color and it starts getting a little bit flatter, part of that is coming from your approach to the color, but part of that is coming from your approach to the value.
That's actually consistent with me. I always find it hard to push contrast for some reason. I don't know why. I always stay kind of in the middle.
Yeah. So if you know that about yourself, I would say if you're feeling like the color's not coming together the way you want, back off the color and then try to overshoot on the parts that you know that you're struggling with the value. And then go back to it again and see if you start to get different results.
Yeah.
I know it sounds a little bit precise, like, you've got this broad problem and it seems like kind of hyper specific, but I found there's a lot of people I've worked with where that is true.
No, for sure. It sounds good. I'll try.
Okay, great. Any questions for me?
Just real quick, not to get any more time because you have one more. I have an issue when picking colors. I guess when I want to shade something, and I want to switch the hue. Like what I found out is if the value underneath the hue is good, it doesn't really matter that much. Like what the hue is,
Yes.
But it's very hard if I'm working in color to pick like the correct value underneath the hue. Is that just experience or should I read something specific about it?
No, I think it's just a matter of like sort of filtering your eyesight. Like you just need to like one of the things that I do is if I feel like okay, I wanted to bring up some more contrast to like this elbow here, I'm typically trying to not pull if it's something where I know I need to change the value quite a bit. The presumption is that the hue is going to also be changing whenever I'm picking from a faraway value. So rather than try to pick the darkest version of a yellow like this, I'll be either reaching for like a much warmer color, like into some of these reds, or maybe into some of the greens. And you can see how, now when I'm just focused on the value, I want to be focused on the value from the perspective of a slightly different hue. So I'm going to be pulling like a different hue to adjust the value. So like this is the first time I've ever said it out loud. I mean, you're bringing up a very, very good question here. I don't think I've ever addressed, but I do this intuitively, and I'm just realizing it now by talking about it. I always pick from a contrasting hue whenever I'm trying to come up with a contrasting value while I'm painting in color. And it ultimately, after doing that across the whole piece, ultimately kind of like ties the palette together. And it feels to me like an essential part of like how the color palette happens. And if you feel like things are looking flat, it might be because you're trying to pick from like in this case, if you wanted to make the elbow darker, you're picking from something that's both a similar hue and value, and trying to like keep it in that same space. And I think that
I'm trying to switch different hues, but it's just I can't do it effectively.
If you've gone through a process that gives you like your a bunch of colors from blending modes and adjustments and things, and you've gone through all that and you like the overall palette, I always believe that the color is like somewhere there on the canvas, and I'm always trying to pick from some other part of the canvas to try to blend it back in, and then that's usually where the solution lies, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right. So last one today is Delia. Delia's here. Hey, Delia.
Hello?
Hey, how's it
There we
going?
go. Good.
I just want to go through your thing really quick.
Yeah.
You normally do it early in the week. You got it at the end of the week here, huh?
Yeah.
Kind
of procrastinated.
That's fine. You were saying how you ditched copying the reference for realism and went for something stylized.
Yes.
Tell us about it.
Well, you can sort of see it too in my time lapse, but I started to like go in a method that I usually do, but I felt very stiff for most of the way. And each time I tried to keep making art, I was like, I hate this. Like it just felt like I was going against the grain somehow, even though like I've done so many studies before. I'm like, I don't know why this one's bothering me so much. So I just like put the reference away and just kind of did whatever I wanted to do. And I've been kind of exploring more with the stylized like backgrounds, so I wanted to explore that more. The character was kind of the last second thing I did, so it was kind of like a last thought kind of deal. So I wasn't really sure what to do for that, but
well, I thought it was interesting because it's like it's hard to reference something without directly referencing it. Like to sort of indirectly reference
Yeah.
it feels like a very, very useful skill to have. And so, you're demonstrating this by really heavily stylizing this, and like, you've been sort of figuring out what your style is, and dialing it in and getting some pretty good results. And so, I thought it was a really interesting result out of the submissions this week. I was kind of curious what your
Yeah.
experience was.
Yeah.
The main thing is like if you could maintain like the level of inventiveness while also kind of keeping it on topic, but then really knock it out of the park with like the face, you'd be
Yeah.
so good. And it's
Yeah.
just like, I wonder, I know you did it last minute. I wonder if it needs like, do you need to do 4 or 5 versions before you dial in like how you're going to stylize the face while keeping it on reference?
Yeah. I feel like I should have my own like character sheet because I just don't know.
Yeah,
what to
you're
do
like
for
building a
most of the
language
time.
for it, and it's your that language has been developing quite a bit over the last year, and like you've been getting some really great results. But human faces, like your animal characters, have been getting excellent. Your simplified animal characters have gotten so good. But like the face here to me is like the weakest part. And
Yeah.
it just I wonder if you, because of the way you've progressed in other areas, like if you could do it, if maybe you just threw some more reps into it. But I know you didn't have time this week.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd like to for sure.
And there's a lot of people who do stylized work in this, in the class. They show up to class each week. Feel free to go ahead and play with the style more and like bring more of your voice into these studies. I'm not very good at that personally, and so I am always impressed by it. I always think it looks really cool. And you ended up having to go through a lot of the same challenges as everybody else in this, but you ended up with a totally different result, which I think is speaks to the level of freedom that people who are doing these assignments have.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Any questions? Anything that's on your mind before I move on to giving out the next assignment?
No, I think that's all set. Thank you.
All right, cool. Great work as always.
Thank you.
All right. So let me see. I have I'm going to give out the assignment really quick, and then I am going to open the floor up to some, oh my God. I'm going to open the floor up to any kind of random questions that come in. So here's the piece. I forgot to check whether or not it was a JPEG again. I think it's a WebP, and yeah, you're gonna have to like convert it to get it into Photoshop or whatever. So this piece, we've been doing a lot of stuff messing with colors. We're not going to do that this week. Let's see. The challenge I have for this week, I wanted to give you guys a little bit of extra challenge here. And I'm going to force you to do something I've had to do a lot with my art over the years. And I've done it, and I just kind of just did it and just took it for granted. But I don't know how much people have to do this. I have had to have so many portrait format paintings reformatted for like widescreen. What I want you to do is I want you to do a version of this paint a version of this scene in 16 by 9. And so let me just bring up, what does 16 by 9 look like? 16 by 9 ratio. It's the same ratio as your computer monitor, basically, right? And I don't want to do it by cropping it. I want you to make this 16 by 9. I mean, let's just say we got a new piece here. That would be 8,000 pixels wide by 4,500 pixels. You can't just crop it. Oh my God. I can do this. I know I can do this, you guys. It's going to be okay. One of these buttons does the thing. I'm going to copy. Let's see, does this work? Yeah. You can't just crop it. And I don't want you to stretch it. I want you to recompose it. This isn't right. I want you to recompose it. Let me see if I can't see the reactions in chat here. Let's see. You guys feel good about this? All right. Watch me stretch it. Yeah. It's gonna look like the wide Putin meme if you do that. Don't do this. I want you to recompose this scene, which this is a landscape, right? This is a landscape with a big wide arch. It should be so easy to make this 16 by 9. I've had to do this over and over again for my playmats. This is the reason I keep having to do it. Sometimes I have a painting and I need to turn it into a wallpaper. Sometimes I need to turn it into a playmat. The playmats, my desk mat size is 33 inches wide by 12 inches tall. So it's actually even more epic and widescreen than the computer monitor. It's like this aspect ratio. So trying to turn paintings that are all portrait format into this ratio is a project. It's an interesting challenge. I end up having to chop the thing up. I end up having to make compositional choices about it. And you know what? It turns out sometimes I like it better after I've recomposed it into like ultra widescreen format. It's a fun little challenge. And so I'm hoping that you guys will have fun with it too. You can do it any style. You can do it with the same color palette. You can do it in black and white. You can do whatever you want with it. But I want to see it 16 by 9. And, otherwise keep it recognizable. A bit scary. Sounds cool. Shouldn't be scary. Give it a shot. I have a feeling you guys are not going to have too hard of a time with it once you get into it. I'm telling you, I've done this a million times. Okay, so I'm going to open up the floor to questions. If you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand, and I'll pull you up on stage. We'll do a question really fast, and we're going to all get out of here because I don't want to go over time too much. I'm always going over time. You can do a watercolor painting of it, absolutely. But 16 by 9 watercolor painting. New type of assignment. I'm always coming up with new ones. I'm really stoked for this. I'm really looking forward to what you guys do with this one. All right. If there's no questions, people are just reacting. That's great. Thanks everyone for joining me. This is always one of the highlights of my week. It's so good to see you guys around. So good to see your homework. Thanks for participating. I'll see y'all next week. Have a good one. Enjoy yourselves. Goodbye.